Colonel Kaggins, thank you very much for joining me from Manhattan, New York City. Firstly, I'd like to ask you about the U.S. Troops in Iraq. The U.S. has reaffirmed that its advising and training mission will continue in Iraq. Do you think in the long term the U.S. government can maintain convincing American taxpayers to fund its presence in Iraq?
Well, Imkatid Bash Besdoon, it's always good to be back in the homes of Rudaw viewers. So thank you for this opportunity to stay in contact. Yes, I'd like to stay in contact with my friends throughout the greater Kurdistan and give you some insights into the United States' continued commitment to ensure ISIS does not come back.
Yeah. So my first question was about that the U.S. has always reaffirmed that its advising and training mission will continue in Iraq. Do you think in the long term the U.S. government can maintain convincing American taxpayers to fund its presence in Iraq?
Well, the President of the United States signed what we call our National Defense Authorization Act. This is a law that describes the funding that will go to America's national security priorities through the Defense Department. And in this law, you have reported at Rudaw that there are hundreds of millions of dollars that have been allocated from the United States taxpayers for the Peshmerga, and also hundreds of millions of dollars allocated for the Syrian Democratic Forces in Magawir al-Thawra down in the Antanf garrison of Syria. Mm-hmm. We say something in the United States, there's a phrase that you put your money where your mouth is. Mm-hmm. And the United States is showing beyond just lip service, beyond words and nice phrases, that we are willing to continue our commitment and partnership with the people of Iraq and the people of North and East Syria to keep ISIS defeated.
Mm-hmm. But you know, this law is for 1 year, and in the long term, do you think this can continue for longer term?
Well, the campaign against ISIS is not something that just happens year to year. The coalition led by the United States has been partnering with local security forces since 2014. And over that time, there have been more than $5 billion directly funding security forces in Iraq, including the Peshmerga, as well as the Syrian Democratic Forces. In addition to that, the United States State Department and partners have provided more than $10 billion in humanitarian assistance through the region. So this is a sign of our enduring friendship and cooperation for the mission to defeat ISIS. But the support and partnership with the Kurdistan region and Peshmerga, as your viewers are aware, goes back further to around the time of the early 90s during the first Gulf War, and continues to this day.
Yeah, I'm going to have some questions about that as well, but before that, let me ask you about ISIS. ISIS has changed its tactics. They are conducting a guerrilla warfare right now. Do you think the train and advice mission of the coalition will be sufficient to tackle ISIS in 2022 with its new tactic?
Well, we've seen ISIS go to these guerrilla tactics where they're using small groups of fighters, sometimes groups as small as 1 or 2, occasionally as many as 10, to attack vulnerable security forces and civilian populations. I want to send my condolences to the families that were savagely murdered by ISIS near Makhmur, and the brave Peshmerga who went to fight them in Makhmur and also Diyala. And these tragic killings are a sign that ISIS remains a threat, but the responsibility for taking out ISIS and that threat is the security forces in the region, the Peshmerga, as well as the Iraqi security forces and the popular mobilization forces that are deployed in the areas where ISIS is hiding out.
And the advice mission of the U.S. will be sufficient enough to support the Iraqis and the Kurdish security forces to tackle this challenge?
Since the onset of operations against ISIS in 2014, the U.S. forces and coalition have been primarily in an advising role. And even as the mission has shifted away from more kinetic and more active combat, the partnership remains. The advising now is at a higher level. You have coalition military officers working with Iraqi security forces and Peshmerga to do planning for operations against ISIS, as well as technical support. The United States is still flying drones to help identify ISIS. And when asked by the government, the U.S. is still willing to do airstrikes. But we've seen those airstrikes that have gone from hundreds a day. Now they're very rare. And a lot of that is because there are not that many ISIS fighters presenting themselves as targets.
Mm-hmm. I see. And you mentioned the popular mobilization forces. The relationship between the U.S. and the PMF has been sour. If it continues with the current trajectory, is there any possibility for full-scale confrontation on the ground in the future?
Well, the U.S. and coalition has not directly partnered with the Hashid al-Shabi in operations against ISIS. But certainly, we know that the Hashid have been a useful force during the major combat operations. There's a lot of discussion happening in Baghdad right now about the future disposition of the PMF. And there are definitely some rogue elements, some criminal elements of the PMF that have conducted attacks against Iraqi bases and Peshmerga bases that host U.S. forces. The coalition will tell you that they have the right to self-defense, but the primary purpose of being inside Iraq and being in North and East Syria is the mission to defeat ISIS. And the government in Iraq and the KRG leadership have stepped up to take on these criminal elements, these terrorist elements, some of them that claim to be associated with Hashid al-Shabi. And there have been successful arrests from the counterterrorism group and the Zaravani in Asaish against terrorists who are planning rocket attacks in the Kurdistan region. And in the federal part of Iraq, there have also been successes by the Iraqi counterterrorism service against these criminal elements.
Do you think arresting some individuals is going to have an overall impact on these groups, especially those which are called like illegal or out of law groups, because they are militia groups, they have leaders, they have weapons, they even can produce drones inside Iraq. Don't you think that more measures should be taken to confront these groups within the PMF?
Well, at this point in the campaign against ISIS, there are so few U.S. and coalition troops that we are relying on our partners in the Peshmerga and Iraqi security forces to keep the coalition troops safe. The laws inside of Iraq are set by leaders in Baghdad, and those leaders have spoken up and given assurances to the leaders of the United States and diplomatic representatives and military representatives that the Iraqis are responsible for security inside Iraq. And it's their choice and their decisions on how to confront and take on the PMF and arresting, not the PMF, the criminal outlaw elements, these terrorist groups. And arresting leaders is important for that. But also it goes beyond that. You want to disable the networks that have lethal aid smuggling, and using intelligence to prevent any attacks from happening in the first place.
I see. You mentioned the support of the U.S. to Kurdistan region from the very early 1990s. Kurdistan region of Iraq was provided security and protection by the U.S. Even before 2003, as you mentioned. Do you think in a probable withdrawal from Iraq, the U.S. will continue to provide this protection and safety to the KRI?
Well, all the indications from leaders in Washington is that the United States is about set right now with its physical presence inside of Iraq and northeast Syria for the foreseeable future. There's no indication that there will be any sort of precipitous or hasty withdrawal similar to Afghanistan. And I think that the partnership will be continuing. It will be enduring because of our mutual interest. You see, in the United States and Iraq has a bilateral security arrangement and relationship. And this extends beyond just military operations against ISIS. This is also a partnership that's an economic partnership, cultural exchanges, and that is an area that will continue to grow. As your viewers are aware, there's a massive consulate from the U.S. State Department being built in our bill, and that will provide even a greater resource for these type of exchanges and cooperations that will grow the relationship. A relationship that's built on mutual trust, mutual interest, and also shared values.
I see. Okay, the U.S. allocated $345 million to support Iraq and Kurdistan security forces. $257 million of this goes to Peshmerga. What does this indicate? Like 75% of the whole budget goes to Peshmerga.
Well, the choices that are made related to the budget and funding can be split different ways, but it's made based on priorities and the request from Iraq and KRG officials. And in this instance, the United States has helped the KRG with stipends for Peshmerga. And there are some of the RGBs, the regional brigades, that are fully compliant with human rights laws. They are trained and disciplined with good leaders. And those groups are eligible to receive stipends to ensure the Peshmerga can get paid. It's really important that we have Peshmerga and security forces who are focused on their military role and not trying to take on other jobs to ensure they can feed their families. The United States recognizes this importance, and as the Peshmerga continue to have reforms, it's likely that support for the Ministry of Peshmerga will continue.
I see. As you mentioned about the reform in the Peshmerga forces, the U.S. has always been supportive to the unification process of Peshmerga forces and also its reforms. Is the U.S. content with the progress made so far?
Well, I'll leave it to my partners who are actually involved in those operations to make an assessment. But it's not just the United States. You also have nations like Germany and Holland who are committed to the Peshmerga reform process and still continuing to advise and assist and cooperate with the Peshmerga. So the United States and its partners have an interest in Peshmerga reforms, but these are reforms led by the Ministry of Peshmerga and will only make a stronger, more unified security force that's able to confront any challenges for the people of the Kurdistan region.
Okay, so providing financial support to a non-American force I'm sure it needs a lot of explanation in DC. How is this support to Peshmerga explained in the DC? What does the U.S. want in return from Peshmerga?
Well, let me give your viewers an opportunity to understand a bit of how this works. The Kurdistan region, the average American, there's more than 330 million Americans. And there's not a lot of time that we learn in school about Kurdish people or the Kurdistan region. So it takes great leadership and advocacy from people in the region inside Washington, D.C. to influence legislation, influence these laws. And I want to commend Ms. Bayan Rahman, who is the KRG's representative in Washington, D.C., and because of the relationships and respect she has earned, this gives her an opportunity to talk to members of the United States Congress, as well as leaders inside the Department of State, Department of Defense, and White House to explain the vital role that the KRG plays for America's national security priorities. Just a moment, I'd like to also talk about a trip that happened in September for the people of North and East Syria. The Syrian Democratic Council sent its leader Ilhan Ahmed here, and inside Washington, D.C. every day, Ms. Sinam Muhammad is advocating for the people of North and East Syria and the autonomous administration. That, as well as the military discussions between Peshmerga leaders and SDF leaders, has resulted in the United States having continued commitment financially and with a small presence of troops to the region.
So you're telling me two ladies are doing this work hard in DC?
That's absolutely right. And so all the young women out there watching know that they can grow up in the Kurdistan region and lead the diplomatic efforts in great cities like Washington and London and have an impact that affects millions of people positively. And when I mentioned before that there are shared values, Bayan and Senam and Ilham, they are well received when they come to Washington, and we open the doors and listen to them respectfully. And where the United States is able, we take action to support the people of the region.
I see. So the U.S. support to Peshmerga is expected to include providing 5 surveillance drones this year. Don't you think having a bit firepower with them can go a long way?
That's right. The U.S. has provided allocation for what we call the Puma drone, the RQ-20. And this is a surveillance drone, but it's a good drone. And what the surveillance drone does, it gives the capability for special operations forces and other security forces to fly out into the desert or into the mountains to identify ISIS hideouts and ISIS holdouts. It's very difficult, as you know, if you were trying to walk through the Hamrin Mountains, you could walk 100 meters and it could take you a long time with the craggy terrain and you might miss something. A drone enables the forces to cover more distance with an eye in the sky, identify targets, and then when those groups or targets are found, people can go on the ground to find them. These drones are technologically advanced. They operate in hot or cold temperatures, so it's a good piece of equipment.
Yeah, okay. So today I think we had a frank conversation. Thank you very much for this frank conversation. However, when U.S. officials are in office, they are much more limited. What does cause this limitation? When you were spokesperson, for example, when you received an interview request, what was the procedure look like? Like what channels did you have to go through to agree for an interview?
Well, as your viewers know, I was always happy to talk to Rudaw, talking to my friend Dilba Khwin or Shakho or Vivian in Syria. And there's a responsibility for governments that are free and open to explain to the public of how they are helping, how tax dollars are being spent, how our mission is improving people's lives. And the process is as simple as asking for some clearance from maybe a higher level leader, a general, or elsewhere. But those choices are made independently. I'm not currently in a role as a spokesman. I'm here at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. So I refer you to them to ask their current procedures.
Okay. Thank you very much, Colonel Kaggins, to join us from New York City, and hoping to see you again here in Kurdistan.
All right. Sir Salah News Piros Bet. Ho Hafiz.
Zos Shpaz. Thank you very much.
Sir Ciao.